Hello.
General Haig, sir. Ready.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Al. What about the casualties last week? You got the figure yet?
No, sir, but I think it's going to be quite low. It should be as last week or better.
Yeah, 'cause it should be less than 20, I would think, yeah.
It'll be very...
when do you get that? Will you know?
We don't get it officially till Monday afternoon, but we can get a reading on it.
Right, well, Monday afternoon officially. Well, let's wait till then. Fine. Okay. Nothing else of interest in the world?
Yes, sir. Very significant. This goddamn New York Times expose of the most highly classified documents of the war.
Oh, that. I see. I didn't read the story, but you mean that was leaked out of the Pentagon?
Sir, the whole study that was done for McNamara and then carried on after McNamara left by Clifford and the peaceniks over there. This is a devastating security breach of the greatest magnitude of anything I've ever seen.
Well, what's being done about it then? I mean, I didn't... did we know this was coming out?
No, we did not, sir.
Yeah.
There are just a few copies of this.
So what about the
volume report?
But what about the... let me ask you this, though. What about Laird? What's he going to do about it? Now, I just start right at the top and fire some people. I mean, whatever department it came out of, I'd fire the top guy.
Yes, sir. Well, I'm sure it came from defense, and I'm sure it was stolen at the time of the turnover of the administration.
Oh, it's 2 years old then.
I'm sure it is, and they've been holding it for a juicy time, and I think they've thrown it out to affect Hatfield McGovern. That's my own estimate. But it's something that it's a mixed bag. It's a tough attack on Kennedy. It shows that the genesis of the war really occurred during 61.
Yeah, that's Clifford. I see.
And it's brutal on President Johnson. They're going to end up in a massive gut fight in the Democratic Party on this thing.
Are they?
There's some very...
But also massive against the war.
Against the war.
But it's a Pentagon study, huh?
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live-ish from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
He's coming back. The chief economist, David Griscom.
How's it going?
Welcome, everybody. So here's what's going on in this week's show. We have Bhaskar Sunkara. We have Ben Burgis. We're talking about the Meidner Plan. We're talking about Finland. We're talking about the history and future of socialism. And then I believe we're going to get to Glenn Greenwald to talk about this massive expose, basically validating everything that we've been saying contemporaneously. And, of course, the great reporting of Brazil Wire. The case against Lula was political. He's a political prisoner. The 2018 elections are illegitimate. These massive, shocking revelations on the true nature of the Lava Jato investigators, what they were really about. No word on Lava Jato t-shirts. We have a bunch more to get to. The gem, shout out. But we've had a major tech problems here today, and apparently it's a YouTube problem. So what's going on is basically we're not able to stream live. And we are running totally behind. In fact, I think that what we might do is actually, because if we're going to get to Glenn, we're supposed to get to Glenn in about 5 minutes. So what we might do, because we're adaptable people, is, let's get to, that's a great idea, Matt. That is a good idea. So what we are going to do is, until we get on with Glenn Greenwald, is reveal my book title for this book that I'm going to do with Zero Books. And I'm going to first tell you guys that this is going to be...
I have sound effects too, so don't let me not get to use those.
Wait, so Is there any you want to use out of the gate even before I announce?
I guess that's going to be the one I'm most excited about.
I think this is an exciting one. Let me hear a few more.
Here's all the people waiting to hear. What's it going to be? Is it going to have the word ideas in it?
So the title is going to be Recovery Mode. No, I'm just kidding. Mine Ideas. No, I'm just kidding. So basically, first of all, it's going to be published in either October or November by Zero Books. And over the next several months, I'm going to be talking a lot more about this. And the goal of the book is not only to have an answer to the intellectual dark web and really the new right generally. I think that even if this whole thing fizzles out and the drama between Quillette and Dave Rubin is already this sort of harbinger of the band is breaking up, and in a couple of years we'll have the most boring, dull, instead of behind the music, behind the YouTube documentaries ever made. I think that this manner of argumentation that you've seen these guys outline, and the really strong interest, which also in a very different way Paul Mason has identified in his new book, just on this sort of like restoration of hierarchy schemes and naturalization of capitalism, but the real intrigue in IQ and sort of reasserting these different types of ideas. And there's a problem, guys?
Yeah, we have a problem.
What is it?
We didn't have audio on the fucking video.
Okay, I don't know.
We can hear it live on this. We have the audio live.
So what are we going to do for the video?
We'll patch it together.
We'll patch it together?
Yeah.
All right. Lots of problems. Aren't you thrilled that I'm not Sam right now? Aren't we thrilled? We're thrilled that I'm not Sam right now. We're thrilled that I'm not Sam right now. Aren't we? Are we not thrilled? So, Matt, are you ready? I will admit, Flo, my thought process was broken a little bit, but the point is to give an answer rooted in what I'm calling a cosmopolitan socialism or a globalist socialism, to answer the intellectual dark web, but also sort of have a map forward for the left that I think actually synthesizes and transcends these false debates between economics and democracy, which I think is a better way of following Bill Fletcher Jr., which is a better way of formulating these so-called identity questions, dealing with the vampire castle problems, but also truly recognizing that, in fact, this project must be truly global, in that sense, drawing on true, a very broad intellectual base for understanding these problems, and also diagnosing the fallacies of like the West, as an example. And also with the starting point that all right-wing projects mythologize and naturalize, and the left historicizes. So without further ado, and I will obviously be talking about this a lot more, and I look forward to you buying this book and us all talking about it, is Against the Web, a cosmopolitan socialist answer to the IDW and the New Right.
There's a little post-hoc drum roll there.
Post-hoc drum roll. What do you guys think?
That's what I think. I'm in recovery mode. I like that.
Yeah.
It's a great title. I'm really excited. I've been able to check out a few bits and pieces of it so far, and I'm really enjoying it. Looking forward to seeing the final product.
Well, I'm honored, and of course, I'm lucky to have such an incredible brain trust around me.
I mean, I like that it sort of puts them where they are, which is online.
That's right.
It's a little dig there, even though we're online, but we aren't afraid to.
We own it.
Yeah, exactly. But also, I don't think that's a title that's gonna risk going out of fashion, because
that was the big
yes.
That was the major thought process, and that was one of the also. This is not just a polemic, and there's only even in fact one chapter on Sam Harris, but like the end of Sam. That was a possibility.
So you're not getting on Joe Rogan then.
No, I think no. The chapter title of Sam Harris's title is "The History is Totally Irrelevant."
I thought it was the end.
No, we chose to go in a slightly less polemical way. All right, so guys, I have a paranoia that Glenn Greenwald won't be here when I call him, just because everything has been so utterly disastrous tonight. But He should be, and we're going to talk about this incredibly important story. Then we'll do the commentary. Then we'll sort of reverse order and get things in a normal flow. Thanks for bearing with us. We're going to take a brief break and be back with Glenn Greenwald about this blockbuster Lavajato story. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for bearing with us through this YouTube disaster that we're dealing with. So I know many of you are listening live, and then we will be releasing this as soon as possible. But, you make do. And joining us now is Glenn Greenwald. He's the co-founder of The Intercept, journalist. Sure you know who he is. He's also the co-author of this massive story that we're going to be talking about today. Glenn, thanks so much for being back.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me back.
So, Glenn, obviously, you know that I've sort of taken to this story in terms of Lula's imprisonment. I've always seen him as a political prisoner. I think there was a lot of reasons just sort of analytically to see potential U.S. influence there, the dynamics in Brazil, and also I think you and I in some ways, might have some interesting disagreements about Lula and PT, but recognized also that Lula really is a distinctly sort of important progressive political communicator in modern politics. So there was this many potential international dimensions to it. But this report really sort of fills in a lot of detail on the speculation that this Lava Jato team were, not clean players, to say the least. Can you center us first by saying what these leaks are, where they came from, and what, I guess, basically the main takeaways are before we go into different parts of the detail?
Sure. So Brazil, of course, is undoubtedly, your audience knows, has been through huge numbers of political crises, including the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in 2016 and the ascension of Jair Bolsonaro, a previously unthinkably extremist figure, in 2018. Corruption scandals, political scandals, economic crises, epidemic of violence. But by far the biggest event and the most important event was the imprisonment of former President Lula da Silva in 2018, in part because he is one of the gigantic figures on the world stage when it comes to world leaders. He was elected overwhelmingly in 2002 and 2006 and left office with a 87% approval rating, brought millions of people out of poverty, transformed Brazil into a country of the future for the first time. I mean, it's hard to find somebody that surpasses his stature. So imprisoning him just for that reason alone is already an earth-shattering event. But it was so much more important because he was planning to run, and in fact was running again for president in 2018. He was term limited out of office in 2010. And all polls showed for a full year that he was not just the front runner, but the overwhelming favorite to win the election. And so you have this task force of prosecutors in Brazil called Lava Jato. In English, it means car wash, led by this judge, Sergio Moro, who have been putting huge numbers of people in prison with the clear goal of trying to get ultimately to Lula. And they prosecuted him in a very dubious way. You and I have talked about this before. I'm sure you've talked about this with other people. And that prosecution of him, that conviction of him by Judge Moro in 2018, once it was affirmed by an appellate court with remarkable and bizarre speed, meant that Lula was ineligible to run for president. So it not only put one of the most important world leaders in prison, but it took the front runner, the overwhelming favorite to be the next president, out of the running. It rendered him ineligible to run under the law, which paved the way for Bolsonaro's victory. And then as soon as Bolsonaro won, he turned around and rewarded the judge who convicted Lula, Sergio Moro, by creating this new super justice ministry position where Sergio Moro has unparalleled powers. And it was an obvious, at least the perception was, a quid pro quo. What makes the leak so significant, the archive that was provided to us by our source, is that there have been all kinds of leaks used by the prosecutorial task force in Judge Moro. They constantly leak to the press accusations that were unverifiable and instantly destroyed the reputation of whoever reputation they wanted to destroy by leaking to Globo that so-and-so was accused of stealing or receiving a bribe. But there was almost no reporting about the prosecutors and the judge themselves. What were they doing? What were they saying internally? What were they plotting? The media turned them into these kind of deity figures, these superheroes that couldn't be questioned. And the archive that our source provided is this gigantic archive of all of their internal discussions, all of their internal emails and audios and videos and documents that enable us for the first time to take a look at what they were doing during the time that they were essentially radically transforming Brazil using the force of law.
So, right. And so, and again, just to reiterate, right. So the sort of the perspective that PT has put forward and Lula has put forward, and I've echoed and have made, disseminated. And I would say another site, in addition to the reporting that you and The Intercept have done all along, there's an excellent independent site called Brazil Wire.
Yeah, Brazil Wire, yeah.
The Indispensable and Brian Mayer, which we've relied on a lot, who've always sort of like, again, as I said, just analytically, you can put together what was on the public record, which are these enormously questionable things. Now, what has Lava Jato's public stance been in terms of their lack of a political bias? And first, let's talk about the team's specific reaction after they had already jailed Lula and removed him from the race. So these radical steps already taken. We'll get to that and what those charges were, what they were saying about that in private context. But them attempting to block him from even getting an interview, which of course he did not get, would seem to run in the face of their kind of public protest, sort of public protests that they're non-biased sources. So what happened with Lula getting access to an interview in the in the last stages of the last year's presidential campaign?
Well, so this was, always the remarkable thing is that not only was Lula put into prison, but he was basically held incommunicado. So Lula is, I've interviewed him twice now, and there's just nobody who is a more charismatic communicator than he is. I mean, you go into an interview with him ready to challenge him, and within 2 minutes you feel hypnotized. Like you have to remind yourself you're not there to like him, you're there to question him. He has this like magnetism and charisma that I don't really think I've ever seen any other political leader possess. And so they obviously were, the elites of Brazil and the center and the center right have been trying for 16 years to defeat PT on the ballot box, and they just got crushed over and over because of the singular force of Lula. So they were petrified that if he was allowed to speak to the public in prison in the form of an interview, that he could single-handedly sway the election to PT. They thought this was their big chance to get rid of PT once and for all, right? They couldn't do it 4 times in a row. They lost 4 elections to PT, twice to Lula, twice to Dilma. They impeached Dilma. They finally got PT out of power. So this is going to be the first election since taking Dilma out of power, and they were petrified that all of those efforts were going to go to naught because Lula was just going to waltz back into the presidency. And so, or once Lula was imprisoned and rendered ineligible, that his chosen successor, who was Fernando Haddad, a kind of young, technocratic, one-term mayor of São Paulo, the one who Lula decided should be the PT candidate once Lula was rendered ineligible, that Lula would have the power to basically cause Haddad to win the election by just communicating in the way that he communicates. So several media outlets, Folha of São Paulo, which is the largest newspaper in the country, but also The Intercept Brazil and me personally, spent 2018 petitioning the court to be able to interview Lula so that the public could hear from the former president about politics, about the 2018 race, about Bolsonaro, about Haddad. And it wasn't Lula asking for it because prisoners don't have a right to be interviewed. It was us, the press, asking for it on the ground that the right of the free press guarantees us the right to have access to him. And finally, about 2 weeks before the election, a particular member of the Supreme Court who's renowned for kind of being a courageous dissenter granted the petition of Folia and one of the most influential journalists in the country, who's great, Monica Bergamo, the right to interview Lula in prison. And they were all ready to do it. And what our leak show, or the leak documents show, and it's one of the stories that we were able to report, is that immediately upon learning that a justice of the Supreme Court had authorized Lula to be interviewed by Folia 12 days before the election, these supposedly apolitical, neutral, non-ideological prosecutors exploded in a rage and in a panic and spent all day plotting on how they could subvert or undermine or block the judicial order. They considered really unethical things like telling the federal police to purposely schedule it after the election and then claim that since there was no date in the order that they complied. They were thinking about themselves petitioning to allow every prisoner to be interviewed, so they would just turn it into a circus and dilute his interview. They were thinking about forcing other reporters in, so it was a press conference and not a one-on-one interview, which would further dilute it. It was all they all looked like political operatives talking about how to dilute the political impact of Lula. But the most incriminating part was, on several occasions, they openly admitted that their goal, that their motive in blocking the interview of Lula wasn't some sort of principled stance that prisoners shouldn't be interviewed, because, as the judge pointed out, the most dangerous prisoners in Brazil are routinely interviewed. The leaders of drug gangs, murderers, rapists. Their goal, they said, the fear that they had, was that an interview with Lula, in their words, would help elect Haddad and would allow the return of PT to power. And the chief of the car wash task force, who has spent 5 years righteously insisting that he has no politics, he doesn't care about any party, he doesn't care about any ideology, he's only devoted to fighting corruption, said to one of his best friends, who's also a prosecutor, "Let us pray that today's events don't usher in the return of PT to power." So everything they've been denying for years, that people have been suspecting but couldn't prove, namely that they are vehemently opposed to PT on political grounds and have been using their prosecutorial powers in pursuit of that ideological agenda, was proven by the documents which we thus far have published.
Another shocking revelation in the documents, which again was already there, at least just in terms of the kind of profound weakness of the case. And maybe I'd also like to weave in a little bit of media critique of this too. If you read a report, from the Washington Post or the Guardian or the New York Times, they'll regularly say, sometimes they'll use more vague terms like graft, which, again, you're more sort of technically safe to say that that is indeed what happened, and then you can get into the merits of the case or not. But they'll actually, use like corruption, charges related to lava jato or money laundering, when the actual case that was sped through and what Lula was put in jail for always seemed, just even what we had in the public record, to be incredibly threadbare. I'd like you to re-review that case. And then these documents also show that, we weren't the only ones who thought that this case might be sort of like shockingly weak.
Right. It's funny because it reminds me so much in so many ways, but including in the way that you just asked me about, of the Snowden case. Because, there were a lot of us who for a long time believed the NSA was mass spying in a shocking, lawless way, in an indiscriminate way on the internet.
Right.
But we couldn't really prove it. So when we would say it, people would say, "You're crazy conspiracy theorists." And so when I finally got my hands on this massive archive that proved they were doing exactly that, so many people to this day, people say, I finally felt vindicated that I could actually see the evidence and that I wasn't crazy the way people were saying. And that's what these documents are starting to do, that people who have been accused of being conspiracy theorists by saying car wash is about destroying PT and preventing Lula's return, that they're fabricating these charges, knowing that they're weak. These documents just completely vindicate all of those claims. And in the case of Lula's conviction, you and I talked about this the last time, and this is maybe one of the areas where we do have a little bit of a difference. I'm not sure, though, is, there are a lot of very grand charges against Lula. that he, as the task force called him in a press conference, was the commandancy or the commander of the entire corruption scheme that ran Brazil for years, and that he has accepted millions of dollars in bribes and all of these grandiose charges, none of which have been brought into court because they're very complicated, difficult to prove charges. There was always this tiny little case that they brought that nobody ever even paid attention to because it was so trivial and so obviously dubious, where they claimed that Lula had received this, what they call a triplex, because they try and make it seem like it's this beautiful, expensive palace like Queen Elizabeth lives in.
Right.
But in reality, it's just like shitty, grubby, like disgusting, very just kind of like mediocre apartment that Lula could buy 500,000 times over if he wanted. So they claim that he received this apartment and renovations to it in exchange for him using his contacts in Africa and elsewhere to get contracts for the construction company that owned it. And the problem was, and it was a pretty big problem, there were no documents that ever showed that Lula was actually the owner of this apartment, that he had anything to do with the apartment even. So how do you convict somebody in a court for having received an apartment as a bribe when there's literally no evidence that they're the owners of the apartment?
Right.
And there was a very big problem beyond that, which is that the only way that this car wash task force and Judge Moro had a right to prosecute Lula, since they're in Curitiba, which is a city in central Brazil, and he lives in São Paulo, was if they could prove that it had a nexus to Petrobras, which it just on its face it never did, because it was a different construction company that they were that they were alleging had given him this apartment. So they were claiming in public and then claimed in court that this was an incredibly rock solid case, and everybody was always confounded, even the people who hate Lula and believe he's corrupt, that they brought this case first, because everybody was saying this is small stakes, and it's the weakest one of your cases because you have no evidence that he's the owner. But the reason they brought it first was precisely because it was such a simple case. It was one quick transaction. We give you this apartment and renovations on it in exchange for contracts that you help us get. And the reason they were so eager to bring a simple case was because the real goal, as we just discussed, was to convict him so quickly and then affirm the conviction on appeal in time to prevent him from running and winning the 2018 election, which none of the other more complicated cases would have allowed. So,
and the lead prosecutor says in these leaks, like there is, I mean, I can't quote it verbatim, but basically something to the effect of, are we sure about this one? How does this relate to our mandate? This seems pretty weak, sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So that's what these leaks, I mean, everybody always knew this case was dubious.
Right.
But what's amazing about these leaks is that not only did the prosecutors, who of course in public were saying the evidence is overwhelming, the evidence is irrefutable, the evidence is undeniable, not only were they saying internally, we think the evidence is incredibly weak, we're not even sure we have a case against him. And I'm not talking about early on, I'm talking about like 3 days before they indicted him.
Yep.
They were saying internally they don't think the evidence is sufficient either to prove that he was the owner of this apartment or to demonstrate that they had the right to prosecute him because they didn't have the jurisdiction for it. And it's amazing how it's not, just the kind of last minute questions that you ask yourself,
right.
like, hey guys, I'm sure this case is really as strong as we think. It was them saying, the evidence just isn't here. And yet they brought the case anyway because they knew that they had a judge in Sergio Moro who was going to convict Lula no matter what, because that was his principal goal, and because, as these documents also reveal, and this is probably the biggest part of the story, which I'm sure you're going to ask me about next, Judge Moro was collaborating with the prosecutors all along on how to construct the case against Lula.
Well, I did want to get to that in a second. I just wanted to spell it because you said there might be a disagreement. And I think that's actually interesting, because I guess my two thoughts, and one thought is much more just sort of simplistic but I think it's worth exploring. And the other is maybe a bigger argument here about how we even use and define things about like corruption, because, and I'll get to the second more interesting point first. I'd be curious your feedback on both. One part of it, it does occur to me that this amount of resource and energy, finances, media support, political support, basically total judicial impunity, which, as you said, we'll get to the most even more explosive things in a minute, that if that tangibly only yields this charge, and I guess, yes, of course, some of these cases are complex, I don't know. That to me is still pretty revealing. I mean, there's plenty of other Brazilian politicians, including ones at the top level, who, there's tape of them, ordering a bribe. There's a lot of much more clear evidence than there ever was with Lula for these more grand, accusations. And it does seem to me that if they're willing to do this from all of our revelations, all the revelations of your work, that it's pretty plausible that doing a PowerPoint where you sort of can, basically imply that Lula is some sort of like Stalinist drug cartel head would sort of fit a pattern of, political warfare or lawfare. That's actually, take that one first, because the second point is actually, believe it or not, more broad than that. But, that's my kind of basic strong skepticism.
I guess like my only issue is, and I'm not sure that we even do disagree, but I mean, I guess, so just to be clear, there are other cases that they have brought against Lula. He's been indicted for multiple other more serious crimes, but none of them have made it to court. None of them have even gotten close to court essentially because they convicted him on this. And so there's really, he's 72 years old. He has a 10-year prison sentence. There's not a lot of motivation to try and prove these bigger, broader charges. So it's not like they didn't bring the case. They have charged him with these broader crimes. I'm just not willing to declare definitively that I view Lula as being free of corruption. Because the reality is that the entire political system of Brazil has been run on corruption. In the U.S., when you talk about corruption, it's usually this Congress member got caught taking a bribe, or like this, lobbyist did something untoward. There's isolated cases of corruption. I would go even further and say the entire system is sort of legalized corruption, which is what lobbying really is. But in Brazil, it's much different. It's like for decades, the way it's worked is if you want a contract with the government, you pay millions of dollars to politicians, senators, governors, presidents, and they just stick it in Swiss bank accounts, and then they give you the contract. That's the way. It's just
this is my.
It's all worked.
This is actually my. Sorry, go ahead.
So I tell you, just like and PT has been the head of the government for 14 years, and there's undoubtedly people in PT, as Lula himself has said to me when I interviewed him, who are genuinely corrupt. So I'm not one of these people who is pounding the table saying, I know for certain Lula was not involved in corruption. What I will say, though, for sure, is that I've never seen evidence of his corruption. And obviously, you should not put someone in prison nor declare them corrupt absent concrete evidence that it's true. And there just isn't any thus far presented when it comes to Lula, in contrast, as you said, to, for example, the president who preceded Bolsonaro, who engineered the coup against Dilma, Michel Temer, who literally got caught on tape ordering bribes to be paid to silence witnesses. So it is significant.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that to me is significant, and I've threaded this, on the show, and I think been pretty open about it. And again, this, any avenue you go, if you're being rigorous, is going to lead to some potential big pitfalls and dangerous outcomes. But I think everything you just said, absolutely. And I've tried to cover the story in a way that, as an example, even re-engineers, I obviously I have huge admiration and support for Lula, and I do think he's a political prisoner. But, when Lula first came to power in 2002 or 2003, and the coverage of him in the States was, here's this radical who sort of learned how to tame and work within the system. To me, obviously emphasizing a willingness to sort of play by certain macroeconomic rules, but that also meant making peace with just the kind of corruption you're talking about. So even there, and what I would say, at least from every evidence that I have, I'm confident in the sort of weakness of any of these corruption charges against Lula, but more broadly, and I think for my purposes even more importantly, is in fact starting to make the types of distinctions between, okay, we're entering into a corrupt deal, and the upshot of that corrupt deal is generating positive benefits for the Brazilian people, which his government undoubtedly did. And I actually think, one of the really interesting challenges we have to deal with dealing with authoritarians more generally is that this very simplistic one-note anti-corruption narrative has been very inviting for the Trumps and Bolsonaros of the world, right? Now, obviously, it doesn't let the hook of the old, let the old system off of the hook either. But I think we can't just say corruption as some big blanket term, because there could be some like, okay, I'm the president of Brazil, I'll pay off some other smaller parties with, proceeds from a construction deal to vote for, providing meals to people and jobs versus, I'm going to stick that in a Swiss bank account and, skim money off the top. These are really important qualitative differences that we need to, complexify, particularly as the right uses that rhetoric to advance itself.
No, it's a great point. And, Lula, when he won in 2002, that was the fourth time he had run for president. He lost 3 previous times because of the perception that he was too radical, that he was too leftist, that he would drive away international capital. The oligarchical media in Brazil, which back then even more so than now had a complete monopoly on thought and information, demonized him so successfully that they made him have no chance. And then in 2002, he decided, look, I can't do anything for anybody by being ideologically pure.
Right.
I have to win in order to get into office and then start doing things for people. I'm going to start making compromises. So he wrote his famous what's called Letter to the Brazilian People, where he promised he wasn't going to bring in his radical leftism of the past into office, that he was going to be conciliatory with, the financial sector. He chose as a vice president this very kind of, I don't want to say Jeb Bush sort of figure, but like somebody just very respected among bankers and, kind of like maybe like Alan Greenspan would be a better analogy. Somebody that reassured the markets that he was not going to be this hardcore leftist leader. And then, one of the corruption scandals in his first term that actually led to some of his top aides going to prison was this vote buying scandal, where they basically, took these parties that they needed to get anything passed, who don't care about ideology and only care about money, and directed, resources to their coffers, to the party's coffers, in order to, for example, get past programs that took tens of millions of people out of poverty. And when I interview Lula, he says, I absolutely made peace with corrupt factions, with the corrupt media, because I wanted people who were waking up, who didn't have breakfast, to be able to eat breakfast and to be able to have a home. And he did all that. And I agree with you. That might be the kind of corruption that exists in the U.S., where, lobbyists write laws and senators who need their contributions approve whatever laws they want because they want to get reelected. But it's not the hardcore putting money in Swiss bank accounts, using public funds as bribes, that a lot of Brazilian politicians have clearly been guilty of and have been found guilty of with irrefutable evidence. But Lula, despite being put under the most invasive microscope, and certainly Dilma even more so, have never been shown to be involved in any of that. So I agree with you. That's a really important difference. The only caveat is that because the prosecutors haven't presented their evidence alleging these crimes, we just haven't seen what evidence they have. But I think the leak that we got, the archive that we're reporting on, and the reporting we're going to do over the next probably, I don't know, certainly months, if not, year or 2 years, is going to shed a lot of light into what they themselves thought about the case and the evidence that they have.
Yeah, so I know, Glenn, we only have a couple more minutes, but I obviously I just want to reiterate. I mean, that is my view without everybody's imperfections. I think he's 100% honest when he says that's the calculation he made. And I think that that's the context of understanding him and PT and why they're an eminently defensible project. And also because of the wins, tens of millions of people out of poverty, you know, that's the distinction there between, say, like Democratic Party figures who maybe rhetorically will make some of the sort of same justifications, but they don't have the record to show at all the same type of accomplishments.
Exactly.
So that's a vital distinction.
Justification, but nothing
precisely
in the way of accomplishments. I totally agree.
Exactly. So talk about Judge Morrow. This will be the last piece. He collaborated with the prosecutors. And maybe there's one other thing that isn't in the leak, but I just want you to touch on too, that maybe you could include in it. One thing that gets forgotten was that there was a ruling last spring, shortly after Lula had been jailed, where a regional court judge had basically said this guy's habeas corpus had been violated. He'd accepted a petition from Lula's lawyers. He ordered Lula released immediately, and the Supreme Court later overruled him, but there was at least an hour or a couple of hours where Sergio Moro just ignored the ruling of a court and violated the law. This was another thing that happened. But maybe you could, put that together and talk about these incredible, like, play-by-play strategy sessions that the judge did with the prosecution team.
Yeah. So, I mean, the role of the judge in Brazil is not 100% identical to the role of a judge in the U.S., but it's like 98%. So, unlike, say, in Italy or Spain, where prosecutors and judges are kind of merged into the same function, judges in Brazil, like Judge Moro, are required to be completely neutral. They can't plot in secret with one party or the other. Any judge that did that in the U.S., imagine a judge secretly meeting with a plaintiff or a defendant and plotting the case that they were then pretending to neutrally judge, would be immediately removed from the bench. Any judgments they issued would be nullified. This is what Judge Moro got caught doing by our reporting. And, of course, people have long suspected that the head of the task force, Delton, who's about 34, 35, was taking orders all along from Judge Moro. And Delton, in his best-selling book, vehemently denied it. And then we have a video of Judge Moro where he angrily, like in this very kind of scoffing manner, says, I can't even believe when people talk about Judge Moro's prosecution theories or Judge Moro's strategy as though I'm part of the prosecution team. He said, as a judge, you learn that your value, your primary value is passivity. You don't play a role in the case. You listen to the evidence and then you neutrally and impartially make a decision. And we have years of chats on Telegram where Judge Moro is giving orders to Delton, the chief prosecutor. Why are you waiting so long to do this? You need to make this a different basically constructing and designing the strategy to make sure that Lula ends up in prison and then walking into court and pretending that he's the neutral arbiter. This is something, Michael, that has turned huge numbers of people who previously revered Sergio Moro, who thought that he was like the one honest person in Brazil, into like Estadão, which is one of the biggest newspapers in Brazil. It's like kind of a center-right to right-wing newspaper that has long worshipped Lava Jato and Sergio Moro, today called on his resignation. Wow. 72 hours after we published our story. That's how extreme these chats are. And, him ignoring court orders. This is what happened. They probably began with good intentions. And this is what Lula told me in 2016, that you begin with good intentions, but once you get turned into like a superhero who was revered and are on top of every magazine, he was named part of the Time 100. He went to the gala with his wife wearing this expensive tuxedo and she in a big gown. You start to believe that you are exempt from all the rules. And that's pretty much what happened. Is the press treated him as a deity and a superhero. Nobody questioned him. Nobody challenged him. And he began to believe that he was justified to do anything, including breaking the law and violating judicial ethics, in order to accomplish his end goal, which is putting Lula in prison and making sure that PT was destroyed. And that's what these documents showed that he did.
And in the last couple of minutes, what has Lava Jato's response been, and where are we? I mean, there's a new ruling coming up on Lula, and what are the prospects of freeing this guy, which is obviously a major goal of this show?
Well, the response of both Judge Moro and the Lava Jato task force was pathetic. It was just trying to turn themselves into victims. You know, The Intercept now has our most intimate conversations and photos and videos, and including of our children and our white. And it's true, we do, but we've made clear that we intend to publish only material in the public interest, unlike what Judge Morrow did to Lula, which is intercepted his private calls and then divulged them all, including ones that were just designed to embarrass him, not ones in the public interest. We've made clear we don't intend to do that to them, but they didn't deny any of the improprieties. Judge Morrow's press conference was this very arrogant anger over the fact that anyone would even think that he has an obligation to address an accusation this tawdry. So they really don't know what to do. They're obviously petrified of what we have. There's definitely a lot of talk, mainstream talk, about the fact that Lula's conviction that was issued by a judge that everybody now knows was acting corruptly as he did it needs to be nullified. Excellent. Because it was the byproduct of injustice. There's a Supreme Court hearing in about 2 weeks being pushed by one of the members of the Supreme Court that hates Lava Jato, that does think that they're corrupt, that has freed a lot of their prisoners. And there's a good chance that the revelations that we just made will end up reversing Lula's conviction and freeing him on the grounds that it was the byproduct of a corrupt judge and a corrupt prosecutorial team breaking every rule of basic fairness in order to put him into prison.
Well, it's amazing reporting. Obviously, I appreciate it immensely, and I think a lot of people appreciate it. I noticed in your great interview you did with Lula, I think he was a little cross with you that you didn't ask him about Venezuela, but he might forgive you as a result of this, Glenn.
I think I've earned amnesty for that sin.
Glenn. Now I say,
want to talk about Venezuela.
I want to talk about Venezuela.
You've talked about that in every interview you've done. I only have 1 hour. I have this menacing guard ready to literally just like pick you up and take you away. I'm not letting you speechify about Venezuela in a way I've already heard. Sorry, I have other questions.
I don't know. My girlfriend said, "Why is Glenn not going to ask the old man about Venezuela? What's the matter with him?" So
she can find that in another. But he did it anyway at the end.
I know, it was beautiful. I'm going to ask.
Out of Venezuela.
I'm going to answer a question that you did not ask.
Exactly.
That was beautiful. And then just briefly, so people can follow all of the reporting at The Intercept. You must read this. You must share this. I think that this is obviously, for Lula, for Brazil, for democracy in Brazil, but I think Lula as a leader in this story has massive global implications. Glenn, I hope you'll come back on in a couple of weeks. There's a bunch more things that I'd love to talk with you, agree with, debate about, and also just think differently about. I think it's always just informative and fascinating for me. And also, if you don't want to say it with me, you can at least make sure I'm pronouncing it right. But I always have to end with Lula Livre.
That's pretty good. And I really appreciate how diligently and scrupulously you have followed just all events in Brazil. It's very uncommon to see, an American pundit or commentator or analyst doing that. So the work you've been doing has been fantastic and rare, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Glenn. Take care.
All right, Mike. I'll talk to you. Bye.
Bye-bye. All right, folks. So are we still off YouTube?
Yeah, it's still not working.
So I will let people know that, who had all these other concerns about Glenn. I just want to say, look, I'm not going to bring anything else into that interview. That story just needs to be treated on its own. I didn't even connect it, to be honest, with some of the things that I think are relevant to talk about with, stuff that Glenn would be far more amenable to, like the Assange espionage charges. But the word is out and the communication line is open to have another conversation with Glenn in several weeks. That would be, that would just sort of put everything on the table, including maybe some stuff that, definitely some stuff that we would debate and disagree about. So I'll see if that happens. But, this case and this story and how much it means, just needed to stick to that for now. This is really a time that you must absolutely get in touch with presidential candidates, with every single member of Congress that, forget even call themselves progressive, that are even going to identify as a Democrat. This man is a political prisoner. I think the conversation around complexifying corruption is very relevant. And, that's actually a good distillation of my two positions. I think, in fact, it's shocking how little evidence, all of the material evidence that we have, and what we know that's on the record with this reporting and what we've already seen analytically is that there is a ultra corrupt far right team that has targeted him along with the media. That's what we know. And then the extent to which I'm willing to stretch is that if the Workers' Party in any type of structural way, or Lula in any type of way specifically, was involved in, cutting deals with corrupt parties in the Brazilian Congress, we see the upshot. I mean, the record is undeniable. It's tens of millions out of poverty. And if you want to address that record and deal with that record and see what we need to do next, your conversation needs to be about socialism and not so-called corruption. So he's a political prisoner. Ro Khanna has already issued a letter demanding an investigation and saying that this validates all the critiques of the Lava Jato team. So thank him, and everybody else needs to do it. So we are just totally off schedule here. We do have to do the commentary. The shout out might wait for next week. But let me just do this commentary really quickly, and then a slight pitch. I am excited that we talked about the book. So we'll do this commentary, and then I'll bring on Bhaskar, and then I'll bring on Ben. And guys, I'm sorry that I'm running late. I don't know if you guys know that YouTube is down. So we were over 20 minutes late starting. It's down. It's I don't know if I guess it is still down.
Yeah,
still down?
I mean, YouTube itself is up, but the live streaming process is completely jammed, apparently.
So TYT didn't. So my speculation, and this could be a tease of some future coverage we're going to be doing. I think that by the way, I don't. If I need another reason to hate Donald Trump, if this is because of them fucking with Huawei, I'm going to be really pissed. You let that company do what it wants. You let China rise. God damn it. What is it? Alex Jones partnered with Huawei to take down YouTube. See,
I mean, honestly, that's not that far behind like me seeing John McAfee's name every time I open up my fucking Dell.
Oh my god! You know the thing about John McAfee is if you watch I forgot the name of it, but there's a documentary about his time in Belize, and like it's not funny anymore after you watch that. But that's the only thing I'll say. It's actually really fucking disturbing. All right, so again, we're totally off. The shout out, I think we're going to just have to get back to next week when we're on normal schedule. And of course, I'll give a pitch, but I do need to go to the commentary that we put together because this is important and actually very relevant to the interview and the revelations from Brazil. So, and I just need to, I'll start by just saying, for purposes of this commentary, your thoughts on anything about Julian Assange are utterly irrelevant. And definitely in the context of this audience, there is a broad range of people who think that he is the lowest form of criminal to people who think he is a unsung political prisoner and hero. And I'm just going to focus, though, on this last month. The United States unveiled an 18-page indictment, including an espionage, 18-charge indictment, including violating the Espionage Act against Julian Assange. Now, let's remember what the Espionage Act is. The U.S. Espionage Act it relates to conveying false reports or false statements with the intent to interfere with the operations or success of the military or naval forces of the United States and to promote the success of its enemies when the United States is at war, to cause or attempt to cause insubordination, disloyalty, mutiny, refusal of duty in the military or naval force of the United States. Eugene Debs was jailed for violating the Espionage Act because of his principled opposition to World War I. And let's, again, setting aside all of the drama of 2016, what did the first wave of leaks related to this charge show? It showed that the United States was committing war crimes in Iraq and Afghanistan. It showed things like the collateral damage video. It showed things like misleading body counts in Afghanistan. And this is not to mention a whole other set of very important things like the U.S. The embassy in Port-au-Prince going to bat for basically the garment industry against the Haitian government trying to slightly raise wages for its people. So what these revelations did, and it doesn't matter who revealed them, showed an unbelievable amount of wrongdoing in U.S. foreign policy. The government's trying to get their revenge while increasing their ability to attack press freedom and silence whistleblowers. Note that the Obama administration, which had a horrifying record on the free press and on whistleblowers, and went after many, and including Binney, and of course Edward Snowden, who must have all charges against him dropped, had to flee the country for revealing vast NSA spying and surveillance, that they actually did not take this step with regard to Julian Assange. These charges are a radical escalation of what already is a shrinking capacity to do investigative journalism, particularly with regards to the national security state. The UN Special Rapporteur on torture has warned against the extradition in the U.S., claiming that Assange could be exposed to a real risk of serious violations and his human rights, including freedom of expression, right to a fair trial, and prohibition of torture and other cruel and inhuman and degrading punishments. Let's also not forget the continued rampant abuse of Chelsea Manning. She is back in prison again, I believe, as of this commentary as we speak. She has been regularly subject to additional jailing and abuse in this process after her initial jailing for being a whistleblower revealing war crimes, which included what international observers consider to be torture while she was in military custody. Edward Snowden still faces threats to his life and well-being and draconian charges here for simply exposing the intelligence apparatus for massively invasively spying on us, as well as violent and lying to the public about it. Governments across the world are ratcheting up their war on journalists, and it's not just illiberal places like Hungary or extremes like Erdogan or Duterte. It's places like Australia, where last week the Australian police raided the offices of their public broadcasting station, the ABC. And this was in response to ABC's reports on potential war crimes committed by the Australian military. The doctrine of national security is being used by governments to justify infringing basic rights. This will impact how organizations report the news. Major news organizations are more likely to be advised to change their protocols and prevent themselves from being targeted by governments. Silencing important revelations, for example, the recently uncovered political motivations in the imprisonment of Lula da Silva. And for those in independent media, the threat of being targeted as an individual by the United States will have a chilling effect. The government is counting on our apathy and many people's hatred of Assange to wage a war on journalists. We cannot allow the future where telling the truth matters to have all of that put at risk. Put this in relationship with the massive expansion of private platforms, the nexus between, in fact, the Silicon Valley firms and the national security state. You have a private-public formula for an enormous infringement on journalism and speech across the board. You know, what the United States says they're concerned with, among other things, with the Chinese telecom Huawei, is its relationship to the People's Liberation Army and Chinese foreign policy. Do you think for a second that the U.S. Defense Department and U.S. intelligence agencies don't work on some level with telecoms, that they haven't been interested in projecting their capacities overseas through Apple and Google? Well, if you think that, I don't actually have anything to fake to sell you. I can't set up like a fake Patreon account, but I'll just say very naive. So set aside whatever you think of him. With regards to these specific charges, we need to agitate against them because they're a threat to journalism everywhere. Okay, folks, really briefly, we continue to grow. If you're listening to this at the moment, I'm sure you probably are, in fact, a patron. But if you're watching this later, I'll keep it short this time because we're running well behind. But it is time, patreon.com/TMBS. In the coming weeks, we will have a lot more information on social media and other fora. I can't help doing that. About what you get specifically. Because, you know, look, you should support the show even if you just like watching the main show. It's a tremendous amount of work, and we put out a lot of information. But the two bonus shows are a hell of a lot of additional information. and it helps us sustain, grow, and do what we do. Patreon.com/TMBS. Get your tickets. They're in the notes to the Chicago live show. And I'll say once again, this fall from Zero Books, Against the Web, cosmopolitan socialist answer to the IDW and the New Right. We're going to take a brief break, and then Bhaskar Sunkara is going to join us, and then Ben Burgis is going to join us. See you in a minute. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show for those listening live and for those watching this later. It feels so weird to not be live everywhere. It's bizarre. Very excited, though, to finally, it's been way too long, to have Crew, the founder of Jacobin Magazine, good friend of mine, author of the excellent new book, The Socialist Manifesto, available from Basic Books, Bhaskar Sunkara. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks. It's like my first time. It's been so long. It's
hey, well, that's not it's not my doing. Look
at this establishment. No American beers. Not around here.
Hey, it's an internationalist project, bro. Yeah. I know we're working on the rebranding. You know, the only time when I think when Harvey K is here, we do try to keep it domestic. But Bhaskar, what is the story? This book is doing a lot of things in my mind. And I think in some ways the most... can we work it backwards? Because I think in some ways the most relevant thing... I mean, the history... I shouldn't say the most. There's a lot of very relevant things about the book. But what I really liked was a diagnosis of the modern trajectory of center-left parties, particularly socialist parties in Europe, but many Democrats in the United States, that the rise of what happened in the 80s and 90s, yes, in certain cases you could talk about, like, you know, probably Tony Blair was never going to be a great guy, regardless of the historical context, right? And sure, you could even expand it to the kind of like, you know, important but, you know, more narrow good government stuff, which is the money started pouring in from the, you know, the corporations as the power of labor depreciated, which is actually a materially important thing, but it reflects a broader trajectory about the nature of capitalism and social democracy, where it isn't about moral failings or just the sort of like gradual corruption of money. It showed the extraordinary successes of what some of these projects had achieved, but also what their real limitations is in the face of capitalist onslaught. I don't know if I summarized that correctly.
Yeah.
I'd like you to tell that story.
So yeah, I guess the story in the 20th century is often told this way. We fought this war against fascism. Then after the war against fascism, there was a post-war compromise. It was a time when capitalists were willing to give, you know, working men and women a fair wage for a fair day's work, and everything was working all perfectly until a new generation of capitalists came around who were more greedy and cutthroat and who betrayed the compromise that we all agreed to, and now we live in this neoliberal era that's completely different and unfair. Well, in fact, the real story of the 20th century is a story of progress. It is a story about lifting yourself out of the devastation of fascism and World War and building a better society. But it was a project that was led, or at least shaped, by the workers' movement. In some countries, like in Sweden, my test case for social democracy that I talk about the most in the book, it was led by a workers' party. It was led by a social democratic party. It was pushed by a really strong trade union federation. And they developed this model where they were able to cajole capital. And they were able to say, you still might own your firms, but you need to deal with our wage agreements. You're going to be regulated. You're going to have to cede so much cash, and we're going to use this cash to build, institutions for childcare and education and housing. So a lot of these core necessities of life were decommodified. They were taken out of the market and enjoyed as social rights. But something happened that Leninists and others didn't anticipate happening. The welfare state didn't buy off workers. It didn't make them more complacent. It made them demand greater and greater things. So if you're a worker in the United States and you have a shitty dead-end job and you have employer-sponsored health insurance, you're probably not going to cause trouble at work because you really need that job. Now, if you're a worker in a country with universal health care, you have that one less barrier to causing trouble. If you're working in a country with full employment, you have that one less barrier than if you're working in a country with 20% unemployment, to actually go on strike, to pursue collective action, and so on. So workers, by 1967 in Sweden, start striking for just for issues of industrial democracy, not just issues of wages and conditions and things like that. So you could say that, yes, there was a post-war compromise, but in Sweden's case, at least, it was broken by workers who started making more and more militant demands, who started to not just question how much they're getting paid, but also started questioning the structure of their workplaces, how many rights they had. Why is it that we cede so much power to this handful of elite bosses, whereas we, the workers' movement, with our massive trade union federation, our affiliated party, have literally been running society? Why would we cede this power?
Right.
So I think then capitalists say, well, we're just going to withhold investment. We're going to cause some trouble because, one, your wage demands are getting too militant, so you're squeezing into our profits. Two, you're making these demands, it's diminishing our ability to manage and discipline labor. Three, there's an international climate that's changing, so there's increased globalization, so international competition, and also there's contingent factors like the OPEC shock and things like that. So capital is basically saying, we're not going to let things go on the way it was going on, and labor is trying to figure out a radical solution to this impasse, the slowing of growth and profitability and whatnot. But it's very different than saying that capitalists just decide not to, go along with this post-war
They had a
compromise
moral. Well, I mean, it's kind of ironic, right? Because the framing of that, they just had a moral change, or some type of increased appetite, is not a very Marxian reading.
Exactly. And also the idea that all of a sudden these center-left leaders that were so great in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s all of a sudden become cowards. It doesn't make sense. Like, my most controversial take on the British the British Labour Party in those circles is that I think that Gordon Brown, if he was born 30 years earlier, would have been the most radical leader in Labour Party history. His background was in the trade union movement. He knows the old socialist songs and the language and whatever else. It was just an era.
He wrote a book. He was part of a book when he was in his 20s called The Red Paper on Scotland, which I think it called for Scottish independence or devolution and radical socialism in Scotland.
Yeah, he came from this labor background.
Right.
But what happened was, you have this crisis, and there's left-wing solutions to this crisis, potential solutions. I guess we'll talk about the Meidner Plan and things like that.
Right.
And then there's the people in the center who are basically there's no problem. We can continue business as usual. And I think those people were wrong. Then there's people on the right that said, well, we're going to solve this crisis by retreating a little bit. So today, our narratives of retrenchment of the welfare state, so the rollback of the welfare state, is often a bit overstated. You still have about 60, 70% of the welfare state, more in some places. You just are no longer expanding it. You're slowly chipping it away.
Right.
And the logic, though, of this right-wing of social democracy was, we are going to deregulate. We are going to allow capital to restore its profitability. And when capital restores its profitability, we're going to tax it and maintain as much of the welfare state as possible.
And frankly,
that's Gordon Brown's logic. That's Lula's logic to some degree. Except he was creating something not...
Yeah, I think Lula still... I mean, the pink tide, to me, in general, the only difference is that they had well, first of all, in the periphery, so they're dealing with way more outside interference to begin with, but they basically in a compressed time zone did a mini version of European social democratic history in several years, and now we see the reversal mainly due to the outside, which has always been sort of the dynamic, right? Of plenty of leaders, Castro was not the norm, more like Michael Manley was the norm of people in those contexts basically wanted to generate social democracies and that not being acceptable. But before we get there, I mean, can you? Even Tony Blair, in fact, that is actually what his government did, particularly in even his first two terms, even as right wing. I think a guy you genuinely can say did migrate to becoming an actual right wing politician. Did in fact follow that formula.
Yeah, Blair's
deregulate and redistribute. He did.
Yeah, but it was more a right-wing radical drift on the economic front. It's like the British Labour Party had this gambit where as part of their grow-give, like social democracy, the part of the economy they thought they could stimulate and grow from was financialized sectors. So it's almost like, I guess in a microcosm, those of you in New York might think of de Blasio this way too, where de Blasio is cutting deals with developers. He's in the pocket of finance and real estate, whatever else the insurance industry is here. At the same time, he's actually helped push through this sweeping universal pre-K bill and things like that. So that's actually kind of like in a sense, grow-give social democracy working in a micro level. But obviously, as socialists, we think there was actually another way, that instead of retreating from welfare state commitments, instead of saying that we're just going to have this group of people that own shit and they're going to run society, we could in fact make some sort of democratic socialist alternative to this situation and to the crisis that social democracy ends up in. But I think that's the key part of that book and that chapter of the book. I was trying to just express the fact that you could chip away capital's power, but if you leave the levers of control in the hands of capital, they're going to roll back reforms and they're going to shake these attempts to slowly, cordon off their power. They won't tolerate it for long. And the post-war period was an exception. It's not going to be the rule. And right now, what we have now is just, capitalism getting its groove back, capitalism kind of just the regular routine of things. It's not this exceptional, bizarre, neoliberal, precarious period. No, this is just capitalism.
Right. And capitalism is really precarious and really unpleasant in many ways. And so, your book is almost like if you're not a social democrat by the time you're 18, you don't have a heart. And if you're not a hardened Marxist by the time you're 30, you don't have a brain. Because that's actually kind of the way I've read it.
Tagline. Yeah.
Well, that's how I read it. It was like, hey, look at these great formulas that we created. That's awesome. And in fact, on some level, and of course, stipulating a lot of other things, you'd have to globalize it. You couldn't have the supply chains you have. But on some level, if you could just have hey, if every country in the world could have some version of mixed market social democracy that worked for everybody, you'd be like, oh, that sounds really nice. But it's like, oh, it doesn't seem like it works like that. So that's why you actually do need, just on a strategic level, these broader interventions.
Yeah, I mean, you need a way to actually take the power of investment away from capital, because often we talk a lot about capital flight and people say, oh, well, if you regulate too much, if you make it too difficult for businesses, they're just going to go to some other country. Actually, it's pretty hard to move a lot of businesses, and especially with certain sectors are unmovable, right? Like healthcare and certain service sectors and so on. But what capitalists can do, what they often do, is they just say, well, now's not a good time for us to spend $10 million expanding our franchise. We're just going to wait till there's another government in power. And of course, the actual working people that will benefit from having new businesses and new investment will be like, well, I was going to vote for that socialist. And, he seemed like a pretty nice guy, or she seemed like someone really committed to the cause. But, this disinvestment's only getting worse. And either that center-left government is going to moderate their program, or, which often happens, or they're going to, just elect someone else, right? And then all of a sudden, the markets will show their confidence, and business will start investing, and there'll be a little boom. And then people say, oh, well, I don't like this right-wing party, but they do sure know how to manage the economy better than these bleeding heart, lefties.
So, and we'll bring Ben Burgis on in a few minutes, but there's the other thing I want to touch on with you, and we'll get to the Meidner Plan later, because I think that is really important. And actually, really, we got to talk about Sweden in a way that doesn't either glorify it, but now I feel like Sweden's a place where it's like the sort of counter reaction to acknowledging, in fact, the massive accomplishments of a leader like Palme is a bit of a problem. But if you were to trace a trajectory, and tell me if I'm reading this correctly, one line of your book is the German Social Democratic Party and the intellectual leadership of that party, and how the tension between that and its actual sort of rise to power, which of course, generated some incredible things, also had some pretty spectacular failures. Then there's this Swedish and Finnish sort of models, which you actually argue in some ways was the most terrifying to U.S. capital. And then there's the Leninist, and then obviously Stalin. But Does that make sense as sort of like three different trajectories of understanding these socialist traditions, at least emanating out of that context?
Yeah. I mean, I think that we should say that there was a common ancestor to a lot of these movements, right? So, in the time of, let's say, by the end of Engels' life, at least, even the end of Marx's life, Marxists of all stripes called themselves social democrats.
Right.
And this broad, early Marxist social democratic movement by the 1910s splits into different traditions and trajectories and whatnot. And in the end, its left wing, its insurrectory wing, especially in kind of the less developed countries of Eastern Europe and so on, pursued the route of kind of storming power and building a socialism outside of capitalism. Then there was a right wing of social democracy that was still committed, at least at first, to the socialist horizon, building a world after capitalism, socialism after capitalism, but eventually just became managers of the system in the interests of workers. And they tried to balance that contradiction. Then I would say the other wing of the socialist movement, which has similarities to the first part of the socialist movement, were those who tried to use socialism as a tool of development and modernity. So these are the Chinese revolutionaries and others who tried to use socialism and use largely a peasant base, not necessarily always a working class base, at least to begin with, to develop production, to catch up with the West, to modernize, to lift themselves up out of the shackles of imperialism and just general underdevelopment and things like that.
Or like Cabral, like return to their own histories that
exactly.
had been stopped by imperialism and colonialism. Yeah.
And you could say that out of these traditions, the most unambiguous success was the tradition of social democracy. You have the complete retreat into almost market capitalism in a lot of these developing countries that tried to pursue a socialist route to development. Even in the case of Cuba, which held the firmest, it was probably the most successful attempt. You're now seeing the need for foreign direct investment and whatever else, the solicitation of certain elements of capital. When it comes to state socialism, people know what happened there. But with social democracy, there really was just, if you were born in a town in Sweden, if you were born in a city like Malmö, you had basically the same life expectancy and life outcomes if you were born in Gothenburg or Stockholm. I mean, that would sound common sense to a Swede. If you're born in 1967 in any of these places, that would be the case. But imagine saying it to an American where, if you're born in like a rough part of LA, or if you're born in Fairfield County, Connecticut, you're going to have the same life expectancy as if you're born in Waterbury, Connecticut, or Hartford. Like, that would be nuts to an American. So right. I think we, there's certain things that as Americans we could actually see in social democracy where many even Europeans or others I think don't understand the extreme precarity of being one illness or slip and fall away from medical debt to losing your job to like the cascading kind of like then being late on a mortgage payment, getting foreclosed and accumulating credit card debt. Like the amount of terror, the sheer terror that pervades a lot of life in the United States just is not quite the same, even much less in 1974 version of Sweden. But even today in places like Sweden and Norway, it's just not the case. It's not how people live.
We'll talk more about it. Obviously, we're gonna have Ben come on in a minute. But like, what is the sort of elevator pitch of this book?
Well, the elevator pitch is that socialism has been around for a long time. There's been successes and failures, but as long as we live in a system that's based on classes, that divides people between people who have stuff, who have wealth and power, and people who don't, and the people who have wealth and power are able to dictate the terms of life for the people who don't have wealth and power, there's going to be resistance to that. So socialism will live. So it's worth examining the history. And I actually do think that there's a feasible alternative to dividing society completely arbitrarily based on accidents of birth between, classes and between races and sexism and all these other things. I think it seems so natural. It seems so baked into our system. But in fact, there's nothing in our DNA that says we have to be this way.
Oh, wow. Well, in fact, and I guess I'm debunking a hysteric from Canada who begs to differ with you, but I'm taking care of that in my book. So we're going to, I guess we'll take another brief break. Guys, thanks for bearing with us. A lot of tech hiccups today, but we're in the zone. Ben Burgis is going to join us, author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left, which is tearing up the Amazon charts, along with, of course, Bhaskar book. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back, Michael Brooks Show. Look at this. The brain trust here. Sorry, Mike. Are we down? This is I'm going to check my Astro charts on tonight because this is not what I like. By the way, astrology is cool. Sorry. Here we are with the Brain Trust. Ben Burgis, he's author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. Bhaskar Sunkara, of course, Socialist Manifesto, and the founder of Jacobin Magazine. I've been wanting to. Have you guys met before?
No, not in the flesh.
Well, here we are. So I wanted to talk a little bit about this, actually, because I want to get into the Meidner Plan, which is really important. And maybe you could outline it, Bhaskar, but I actually want to put this in conversation in the last segment before we go to the post game. I want to put this in conversation with the debunk that Ben and I did last week about would a greater, in a very broad sense, because I actually want to move, I think co-ops are cool, but I want to move well beyond co-ops. I want to move to stakeholdership. I want to, because maybe that's also the wrong word, but just some idea of far more power over your economic life and far more leisure time and far more basic power to do what you will in an economic sense, right? So, but that being said, the debate that Ben had with Destiny, who's a prominent Twitch streamer,
Really?
which sounded funny. Yeah, that's actually what he is. No, Destiny's very. In fact, Destiny does a very good job at this stuff. He's in this new New York Times piece.
Twitch streaming is like the gaming thing, right?
He plays video games and talks about politics. I have no idea, dude. Don't ask. Don't.
I'm getting sorry. I don't want to derail.
You're getting so
I don't know.
Sidetracked.
Yeah, sorry.
I mean,
Bhaskar is Larry Daviding me here. It's like Twitch stream.
Yeah.
What does he Twitch?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I've played a video game since like Mario Kart, so I don't I was doing,
I wasn't allowed to play video games because it would have gotten in the way with my astrology.
I played video games as soon as I finished this book. I played Red Dead Redemption. It
was there
great.
You go. That's very
half
on
of it was
brand.
like you had a horse. It was your friend. You fed it. You did chores. There was lots of chores. Anyways,
the point of the debate. Destiny did a great job.
Astrology is really bad.
Shut up. Don't bring that nerd shit to my show. So, unless in the way we like it. He's bad. Shut up. Whatever. I will. So what'd you say?
Said he's such a Libra.
Yeah, exactly. That was such a Libra thing to say. Or whatever sign says.
Yeah, I just don't think my personal branding can survive me sitting here listening to stuff about astrology and not saying anything.
Well, no, it's all right. I mean, look, even if you don't believe in it, it believes in you. So, anyways, but I wanted to give Destiny props. In the piece in the New York Times on YouTube radicalization, which we'll talk about another time, he was actually cited as an example of this kid exiting the fascist right because of his debate skills. So props to Destiny. The debate
got a DM from that kid a few months ago saying like, hey, your videos helped me. So that was cool.
That is very cool. So this kid got turned on to all the good stuff. Maybe you got a DM from him too, right?
Yeah, I've been DM with him for a while.
Yeah, it's like Matt's just like, my DMs aren't open. I'm sure that's why, obviously. So, anyways,
now, he specifically told me that when he watched this show, that almost brought him back into the alt right. But but then this
because
rest
I
of the
said,
stuff
well, I think you can believe that obviously we should have a sense of the planetary alignment. And that doesn't mean that we should have a fascist government.
Listen, if the moon can impact the tides, you don't think it can fuck with your brain? Think about it.
Yeah.
Think about it. You're there first.
Thank you. Thank you.
You also don't want to expose somebody that early in their re-education process to right-wing Mandela, I feel like.
Really? You're going to watch Ben Burgis?
I'm a siren song.
Yeah, let's put you to work at Mondragon. You'd probably prefer to smoke weed and watch Rolling Stones montage videos. Meanwhile, Bhaskar, his parents flee the fucking Caribbean via Snipeball territory so they can get a real fucking job. And he's running around talking about how they should turn the whole world into a fucking subpar Caribbean economy. Fucking cocks. I miss doing that. So they were debating, can co-op worker-owned economies have an effect on the climate crisis? And I want to put that in relationship to outlining the Meidner Plan and really opening the dimension of workplace democracy and the other part of the subtitle of your book, which is a case for socialism in an age of extreme inequality and planetary crisis, if I recall correctly. So let's bring those two things in relationship, and maybe could we use the Meidner Plan to help sort of set that up?
Okay, so the Meidner Plan.
Yes.
It's a bit complicated because I could give you the very simple version, but I'll give you the intermediate version, which is
nice.
The Swedish system is very unusual in that the welfare state was not created just by the state. In fact, a lot of the system was actually created by collective bargaining. So you have this massive trade union federation, the LO, and also there's a large employer federation, the SAF, and they set certain patterns of bargaining based on the principle of equal pay for equal work, not just within one workplace, but across all the workplaces in a sector, which means that essentially if the three of us are running different businesses, and let's say you're running GM, I'm running Ford, and you're running Chrysler, right? Yeah.
Ben totally got fucked in this analogy.
Let's say in this case,
I'm literally from Lansing, Michigan, where Fords were traditionally produced. I think I should get Fords.
Okay, well,
no, you're a Chrysler. Just accept it.
You're about to be bought out by the Italians.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
disgraceful.
Oh, look, Fila called. They want to own your company now. Cock. The first car company to be taken over by an 80s sneaker firm. Ben Burgis as Chrysler.
So you have GM is the most efficient producer, right? So they are the most productive firm. Let's say Ford is in the middle and Chrysler is at the bottom.
Definitely.
So what you would do in a sectoral bargaining agreement is you would set your wages not on your ability to bargain in your particular workplace or even in your particular company, but you would set it to some sort of benchmark level. So we would maybe set wages in this agreement at my firm's level because I'm in the middle, which means essentially that Chrysler would be squeezed by the high militant wage demands, and in fact might go out of business. You would either have to figure out a way to become more productive, you develop more new labor techniques or whatever else, or you would go out of business.
Even in a cock economy like Sweden, survival of the fittest is what Bhaskar is saying.
Yes, it would be. It would be, actually. Yeah, it was actually quite a dynamic economy.
Yes,
so these wage
this is actually
demands,
important. The dumb commentary
you can't move that quickly
from
Mandela to real.
I was trying to set you up, though. This is relevant. It was a very dynamic economy.
So what that does, though, is it allows me to survive, right? Because it's set at the wages that I can afford, but it allows you excess profits. So in other words, if we were in a sectoral system, it's possible that your workers might actually be able to demand even higher wages, whatever else, but they're actually setting their demands pegged to me in the middle, right? So this excess profit, in theory, allows you to expand production. So the workers displaced in your firm could in fact then, through active labor market policies and government retraining and whatnot, they bounce in this cushy welfare state that's been created. Then they're actually moving into your sector. So the most efficient firms, the firms that are, it encourages one, capital intent, basically labor saving technology. So that's why Swedish firms ended up being super high tech and whatever else, because labor was expensive. But it allowed the most efficient firms to expand. And then you can imagine this cycle continuing, whereas maybe this time, I'm at the bottom rung and there's another company in the middle or whatever else. So what happened in the 70s was the Swedish labor movement started saying, well, not only are we discontent with the level of industrial democracy, not only do we want to push social democracy even further, and we're kind of frustrated by all these capitals, we're finding that Swedish capital is no longer productively investing these excess profits. So instead of you being the most efficient firm, then taking these profits to expand your production, Swedish capital is just kind of sitting on it. So the logic of the labor movement was that we in fact are subsidizing the most efficient firms, whereas we want to recapture some of that wealth and we want to actually make sure that it's put to good use. So the idea of the Meidner Plan wasn't just an ideological thing. Workers should slowly take over their firms through creating these wage earner funds and whatnot. It was also practical. We want this capital better invested, so we're going to try to capture this capital. And the idea was that there would be a slow accumulation, slow buying up of shares, where in the course of 20 to 30 years, these funds run by the trade unions would slowly buy up shares in the firms to the point that, maybe in 20 years they become the majority shareholder. And they could also demand that, in fact, this excess profits are actually used and expanding the economy and so on. So it was meant at different levels. When they passed the Meidner Plan, they sang the Internationale. They thought it was a socialist triumph for ideological reasons, but also had this practical element too.
So bring that into relationship, if you can, with this debate. I mean, because again, there is a lot of bridges here. I mean, I would imagine this might also correlate with why, and related in some respects to the technological innovations, why obviously a place like Sweden has a much better environmental performance. Like, the argument was, and actually I'm trying to represent him well, because in a narrow sense it makes a lot of sense, which is like, if environmental problems are exacerbated because basically private firms discard concern for a global environment or even a local one because it undermines their profit accumulation, why would that same sort of logic necessarily have a major impact even if the firm was more democratized? And I guess what I'm trying to get at is that the process by which you would start to actually democratize these firms would entail such a sort of structural reorganization, how you're doing the economy to begin with, that it would necessarily have a spillover effect. And therefore, it would be different than, as an example, AFL-CIO, who I actually have a lot of respect for, and I think we need to pay much more proper respect to our old school unions, whatever their many flaws. But people will say, like, hey, look, the AFL-CIO will come out and support some destructive environmental policy or oppose a Green New Deal in some ways, which is, not good, but they're doing it in the sense of trying to fight for scraps in a capitalist economy, not in the Meidner Plan or what you were advocating, which would necessarily have a spillover effect.
Yeah. In the discussion with Destiny, I was doing what I usually do when I talk to like skeptical progressives who like maybe agree with me about a lot of social democratic stuff,
right,
but like aren't sure about the idea that we could go beyond capitalism entirely, which, is a variation of what Bhaskar does in his book, which is to sort of say, well, not that this is necessarily the, like the last possible step in the evolution of social organization. I've got that inner Dave Grisham in my head, saying, now this isn't nearly communist enough, That's not,
after you explain that, David's going to explain what communism is, and that's when we're going to go to the post game.
Okay.
Yeah. I only have the best brains around me, so David keeps teasing it. Now I want to hear it.
Yeah.
But yeah, go ahead.
But like, one of my favorite articles from your magazine over the years was The Red and the Black by Seth Ackerman, and he's got a really nice like methodological point at the beginning about how it's good to start with something that you can realistically imagine based on what you have, not because that should be the outer limits of your imagination, but precisely because by establishing the point that we could go beyond capitalism, it actually expands our imagination. So. Right. The version of it that I was trying to push with Destiny was basically like what you get in a lot of DSA documents, which is, hey, we could nationalize the commanding heights, some things like healthcare that meet basic human needs. There's plenty of precedent for advanced Western democracies doing these things effectively, like the NHS in Britain. Right. Or for that matter, the coal industry in Britain for a long time. If we do still need a private sector, or something like a private sector for the sake of solving calculation problems, setting prices, all that, then, hey, at least it can be a cooperative private sector. And I think that in a certain sense, right, this is the point that Hassan Piker was objecting to, right? You know, when I kind of said, yeah, well, okay, that's a fair concern, but I've got some responses. I do think that Destiny's point is not totally unreasonable. You know, he says, hey, to the extent that you're saying, don't worry, this would still have the benefits in terms of market mechanisms for dealing with calculation problems, et cetera, that capitalism does, then it's open to the concern that, wait a second, it would still have the same bad market incentives for things like climate change that capitalism would have. And I tried to respond in a few ways. So just real quick, one of them was the point that Hassan wanted to emphasize, which was that at least certain forms of environmentally damaging activity, like fracking, actually have really bad consequences for the communities of the workers who are engaged.
Where obviously the workers will have a totally different incentive structure to care for themselves than an outside owner, capital.
Exactly. And I think
that's a strong argument.
And I think that is a really strong argument, but I don't think it's enough. The reason I don't think it's enough is that it's good for, like, oh wow, the fracking is, you know, fracking up the water, but it's a little bit less effective for, oh, we're just slowly eroding the ozone layer, which has bad long-term consequences for all humans, workers or owners. But doesn't necessarily have short-term enough bad consequences for the workers to be motivated by it. And so, which is why I tried not to rest there. I kind of mentioned the point Hassan wanted to mention, but I also said, taking a page from the first chapter of the Socialist Manifesto, that, hey,
you're doing a good job plugging my book. I'm liking this. I'm liking this. This is a smart man right here.
See, there is a methodology to gas selection. These like shabby intellectual bastards who come on my show never understand the design.
It's a pretty good book. If you could only afford one of them, you should give them an argument. But if you can afford both, you should also get that one. But taking a page from the first chapter there, there's a discussion about how if we nationalize the banks, then we can set as a matter of public policy that one of the criteria you use to decide which new cooperative ventures get business loans is environmental impact, and there's really no equivalent that we can do with completely private free market capitalism to that, right? Like there's really no way to get private banks to take that into consideration the way that we could, I think, with public banks.
And under either capitalism or the system, you could also use the state. You could use legislation to set certain. So even if the micro logic of a firm is to pollute, you could regulate. You know, and that's so in other words, like even climate change itself can be solved within capitalism if there was a strong enough state and regulations and things like that.
So that's also the other, and this is, I think, a little bit trickier. This is maybe the reason some of this got lost in the debate, because you have to sort of go back a couple more levels to kind of think about how this works. With Destiny, that some of the things that I'm talking about under a form of democratic socialism that would help with climate change are on paper things that you could have under capitalism.
Right.
So, for example, if you had a universal jobs guarantee, which has often been proposed as a reform under capitalism, that, you know, that was a major theme of the civil rights movement, you know, in the last stages, then you would have a totally different set of incentives for workers, because, you know, even a coal mining cooperative, even if that wasn't nationalized, even if it was a private or quasi-private cooperative, that wouldn't have those incentives to despoil the earth for future generations for the sake of having jobs right now, or at least not as strongly if like having to transition to something new didn't mean going through this period of destitution while you were waiting for the new thing to kick in. And so I think it's fair that somebody like Destiny could say, hey, but wait a second, we could do that under capitalism. But then I think the point is, well, there's a reason that hasn't happened under capitalism. And this, I kind of feel like, you know, like I've already praised the book competition too much, you know, but like I'll give in one more time and say that, you know, this is one of the major themes of Bhaskar's book, that they have that there is, you know, like he quotes repeatedly Rosa Luxemburg's metaphor about rolling the boulder up the hill, right, with reforms. And as long as we still got capitalism, there's always the danger that, you know, to one extent or another, it's not instantaneous. You know, the Nordics are still, you know, way ahead of us, but the boulder is going to be rolled back down the hill by the capitalists. And so this would be a particularly hard ask for capitalists to accept, because a universal job guarantee would really change the balance of power on the shop floor between workers and owners.
So basically, in all scenarios, you're agents of the Chinese hoax.
Go ahead. Two more things to this thing of climate change. I agree with everything you said, but I would add that one, if your incentive in a worker-owned firm is to maximize not total profits but profit per worker, there's less of the imperative to just grow. So I would guess that under a kind of worker-controlled economy, even if it's still a market economy, the average firm size will be lower, production will be lower, and the footprint of every firm would potentially be lower. It might actually be, though, that there might be like environmental benefits to a certain scale. So I'm just like that's a half-formed thought. And the second thing is, under any system of socialism, it means that even if we still have a sphere where firms are competing in the market and producing consumer goods, it also means that the commanding heights of the economy, all the natural monopolies and things like that, would still be under the purview of the state. So there'd be a lot more democratic planning going on anyway. And the state can actually set the terms for the medium and long term. So if you're going to do a medium or long-term investment priority, individual firms under capitalism or even worker-controlled firms, they can't do that because they have to operate by a short-termist, logic and mentality. But an actual more powerful state, a democratic state, can make medium and long-term planning decisions, and there won't be the same constituency, like politicized constituency because there's not permanent managers and things like that. So right now, if you try to do something like that, there's immediately going to be a fossil fuel kind of lobbying group or whatnot. Right. Like I don't think the same dynamics would apply in a different sort of system.
We got to go. We do actually have to go to the post game because we got to get some of that time in, and we're just all fucked up. But we got to do a real post game. But really quick, David Griscom, communism. What happens?
Communism.
Oh, I mean, I don't think it's too. I mean, honestly, I don't really think it's too worth it to jump into with the
David,
blueprint.
these guys are total. Come on, they're mealy-mouthed apologists for the status quo.
But I think
we know what they are. Just lay it out. Come on.
I think that you replace the system of competition with a system of association, and that challenges exactly the kind of logic that leads to the pollution of the earth that we're talking about. Where individuals who own an organization, they're putting the profits of that organization over the social cost for the rest of us. And putting production in the hands of the majority and in the hands of the demos is really going to radically change that. At least has a much larger potential to radically change that than any kind of individualized system that we have now.
Well, obviously, I agree with that in the abstract. We believe in kind of a free association of producers. The question is, how do you actually do it in condition of relative scarcity, right? We still need to ration resources. We still need to kind of motivate and compel each other to actually produce. So I think in the long run, we will live in some sort of fully automated, to use Bastani's thing, fully automated communism or whatever. But I think we're still in a condition of relative scarcity, particularly in the global south and other places that actually need to grow. So I think we need a growth, an environmentally sustainable, carbon zero growth socialism.
Yeah, and I just want.
So guys, how are you going to figure out how much tofu each of you get in your perfect little sissy system?
Well, that is a good question. But one last.
Ben's more Satan.
Sorry, go ahead.
One last thing about this, though, I would also say that when you think about some of the stuff like the coal lobby, right? Because Destiny's point's going to be, but wait a second, we could just get the coal lobby that's sponsored by the coal mining cooperative, and it would just be the same thing. And I think that the reason that the free association of consumers, even in the watered down bullshit Menshevik way that we're talking about, would impact that, goes to the same thing as, why the environmental record for state socialism was so bad. Well, because there's no democratic input, right? Even, East Germany was worse than West Germany because at least in West Germany, you could have an environmental movement that could make
West
noise.
Germany had a massive green movement.
Exactly. So, and by the same token, just the fact that so many more people would be in on the decision, when somebody that instead of like 3 people in a room being like, hey, let's start the Coal Institute for Honesty about, clean coal, if somebody wanted to do this, even if you didn't have like whatever, a referendum on it or whatever, like even if it was like a management level decision, the next time there was a management election, there would be thousands of people thinking about this and talking about this, and this would be an obvious huge issue in that election. Oh my God. Did you hear
I mean, for what we know, I'm just to underline it before we go. I mean, from what we know, there's no reporting that I've seen, and this is, totally in the realm of what we're talking about. I mean, that the Madragon Collective in Spain has secretly funded AstroTurf organizations to debunk climate science or anything like that.
But part of it though is if you do have a system though that is built around firms competing and you're not regulating that competition, then firms are going to find a way to get an advantage on other firms, and they're going to exploit each other. They're going to exploit themselves even to accumulate market share and whatnot. So I think the key is you still need a state, you still need regulation. The thing that we don't like about capitalism is wage labor, because it means exploitation within the workplace. But under any form of socialism, even kind of I think we have a very similar vision of what a social society should look like. There's going to need the need for constant vigilance, for a free civil society, for like politics to continue. It can't, like, we used to think of socialism as the end of politics, but it just has to be
the enhancement of politics. But anyways, before the post game, David Grisham, the non-cock version of our socialist future.
Oh, I just want to say that Lenin almost immediately instituted the largest natural preserve and national park program in history. So. Interesting fact.
Socialism
what happened to
here
him?
In America.
What happened to him?
Well, he died.
Shot by an anarchist.
Wow.
Yes, indeed. Boo. So yes, indeed. Hiss.
I like the way David said it. David's just like, yeah, you know who did that? Lenin. So, yeah. Maybe you should give him a little bit of appreciation the next time you're jerking off some stupid Norway plan or whatever. Okay, so we're going to go to the post game. We've got a bunch of sound to get to. I actually want to play this Steve Bannon, Thomas Friedman love fest on the China trade war. Get a Marxist perspective on that. And so, yeah, and a bunch of other things. So, guys, sorry about the tech delays. It's YouTube. Appreciate each of you. Patreon.com/TMBS. We're well on our way to our next set of goals, 2,500 and 3,000. Get your tickets to the Chicago live show. Buy these gentlemen's books. There's links in the show notes.
I can say I finished yours on Audible. Sorry, Ben. That's why I got the Bhaskar's first. But very good. I enjoyed it a lot.
Who did the narration?
Just some guy. Wasn't you. I was disappointed.
Yeah, it was definitely
No, I know it wasn't me. I mean, shit, I would have
I wish it
remembered that.
was you.
Remember that 18 hours of my life. But
you should have had me. I could have done it as Obama. It's like Kotsky had a different approach.
Yeah, you know.
So, yeah, that would have been fun.
Which I actually do keep getting audiobook questions about giving an argument.
You should totally do it.
I'll be a day one purchaser.
And we
Is Ben Shapiro really using logic here?
Well, that was the best suggestion that anybody made, because we were talking about it. I was like, well, Doug was saying he might do it for free or whatever, but I think there were a couple of people who were like, no, Michael should do it in the Nation of Islam Obama voice.
I think that's a good way to make Michael sick of any one of those impressions that you make him do for 17 hours.
Not the Clinton one. No, the Clinton one is like more natural. I bet he dreams in the Clinton one.
I do. That's my natural state. Just because it's in an ad hominem does not mean there was not a logical sequence. Let's go back to Proposition A.
You could have like different chapters read in different voices.
Well, and of course, look forward to my book, Against the Web, Cosmopolitan Socialist Case Against the IDW and the New Right, coming out this fall from Zero Books. But buy these guys' books immediately. Become a Patreon immediately. Thanks to each and every one of you. Check out Matt's show, Literary Hangover. We'll see you in the postgame.